to the lecture of the history of race in America. We'll start off this module with a brief overview of some key elements that I'll ask you to think about and engage with in the additional resources and the assignment at the end of the module. To give you a sense of the road ahead, we will talk first about a few key terms and definitions that will be peppered throughout the framework of this lecture, as well as some unlearning of major moments and movements in American history, some things you might have learned about in your American history class thus far, whether you're a student that's in college now, in high school, or someone who's lived lots of life with lots of your own personal history. I'm hoping that this lens will allow you to rethink some of the things that you might have learned in the history classes from your youth. And then I want us to think about, now that we know this information, what do we do with it? What happens next, both in terms of what's coming in this class, and then also how you might take this knowledge out in the ways that you engage with your communities and with your families and with others you may encounter in the world. So to start off with some key terms and definitions, there's really only two that I have as the framework for this particular lecture. The first being the idea of social construction. Now, this is actually a term that comes out of the work of sociologists. However, it's important that we understand this term as we understand the ways in which American history has been written and told in the United States to date. First of all, the idea of social construction arises from the notion that humans are responsible for creating certain ways of being and ways of thinking in the world, and race is one of them. In that regard, that social construction is shaped by the knowledge that we generate and deem worthy, the language that we use to describe certain things, and our values, our interactions, and our relationships that inform the ways in which power is constructed on both a community and social level and also on a political level. When we combine the idea of the social construction of race, or the idea of a social construct, and we couple that with history, we arrive at what is, I think, hopefully a simple equation, but really not something to that is so simple to wrap your mind around, and it's the idea of a subjective truth of the past. Now, I'm sure that any of you who have studied history in the past may love it because it's names, dates, and facts, and those of you that hate it probably hate it because it's names, dates, and facts, when in fact, the study of the past is actually the study of understanding what has been left behind by generations before us. And as a result, there's a certain amount of power inherent in what is deemed worthy to preserve and what voices are heard or silenced when we kind of recall that past. As a result, we place a heavy emphasis on evidence in history. So you can imagine that if one were to want to silence the atrocities of the Holocaust, that to get rid of any archives or evidence that might speak about those times would be a good way to do that. It also means that when we're talking about something like race as a social construct, that those of us who are in power to be able to put materials out there for future generations to see are also able to control the narrative. In that regard, American culture has placed a heavy emphasis on the written word and documents as a way of preserving the past, which of course sets other cultures at a disadvantage if they're in a different language or if they're not written down at all, say your indigenous cultures that are largely based on an oral tradition, for example. So that's why it's important that when we think about the idea of race and as a social construct, we think of the ways in which that social construct has influenced the way that history has been shaped and told to us throughout the generations that have followed since the founding of the United States. The second term that I want to introduce to you all and to inform the way that we're going to talk about the history of race in America is the idea of intersectionality. Now, I don't want us to think that race is a discrete item in American history that we can study separate from all these other identity and political characteristics, such as ethnicity, gender, class, and religion. All of what we'll learn about race is influenced by the social, political, legal, and cultural and economic impact of things such as class and religion and gender and ethnicity throughout American history. All of us are persons with overlapping identities that include race, among other things, and therefore, whenever we want to single out something like race, we also have to look at the contours of other identity characteristics and the ways in which they shape the ways that race has been socially constructed in the United States. So now that we have those two basic frameworks at play, social construction of race and the idea of intersectionality, we're now going to look at a few major moments and movements in American history that you have likely learned about or at least heard about, and some that you might not have heard of at all. I have 8 here in front of us, but we're not going to look at all 8 for the purposes of this lecture. There will be an assignment at the end of this module where you'll have an opportunity to look at some of the moments and movements that we did not discuss in this lecture. And so I'm just going to focus on discovery of the New World, the Civil War, Reconstruction, eugenics, which some of you may not have heard about at all, immigration reform, the Civil Rights Movement, and the notion of a post-racial America to bring us up to date. So I have the words discovery and New World in quotation marks very purposefully here. It is likely that like my son and many of you have probably learned about Indigenous history in a very, let's say, palpable manner. When I was growing up, the idea of Indigenous history or the role of Native Americans in the formation of the United States was painted as one of either savagery or sort of savagery in terms of violence or savagery in terms of innocence or a lack of civility, and that the Europeans that came to the continent brought civility with them. Now, one of the things that I like us to think about in terms of unlearning that kind of dynamic, and I should say before I move on, that is also a lesson that as recently that I know is still being perpetuated in today's classrooms. As recently as last year, I have an 8-year-old son, and one of his social studies lessons at the time of Thanksgiving have painted that exact portrait of indigeneity, which I had to basically help him unlearn in a way that's palatable and acceptable and understandable to a then 7-year-old. But what I would like us to do is actually rethink something like that particular narrative in the context of this quotation by one of my absolute favorite authors, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whom, if any of you are in Hickory in March and are fans of the Visiting Writers series, she will be visiting the Lenore-Rhine campus in March, and I'll actually be in attendance on the event, so maybe I'll see some of you in person then. But in her TED Talk from 2009, The Danger of a Single Story, Adichie is famously quoted to talk about the idea of power and narrative, and the way that we begin and who we focus on in those narratives shapes the ways in which those narratives are told. And in this quotation, I want us to think about this last part of the sentence that she has here that says, start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. So much of what we talk about in terms of Native American history has to do with that first contact with European settlers. However, if we were to view the sort of colonization through the lens of the indigenous, we'd be looking at a very different dynamic in terms of the quote discovery of the quote New World. So if you think about your typical American history education, we usually start with a very European lens by focusing on the colonizers, and then we trickle down into discussing the ways in which Europeans engaged with African slaves and indigenous cultures, and then how Latinx, Asian Pacific Islanders, and other immigrants became to come into the United States that is now largely established by people of European heritage. What if, in fact, instead of starting with that European lens, we started with an indigenous lens that viewed that first contact not as one of exploration, but instead of one of genocide, which we know, in fact, that many indigenous cultures were all but decimated as a result of European explorations by the British, the French, and the Spanish. We could also look at that from the perspective of the slaves from the transatlantic slave trade, as opposed to looking at them as a resource for Europeans, looking at re-engaging with the humanity and the agency of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. From there, we could also look at issues of industrialization, the ways in which certain decisions about citizenship and personhood and rights were made as a result of the economic engine that drives the United States. So again, we're looking at race and class here. And likewise, when we look at the issue of globalization, that we're also looking at the ways in which people have moved throughout the world as a result of particular political, social, or economic crises or opportunities that exist in different parts of the world. In immigration history, and I'm primarily an immigration historian, we talk about push and pull factors. What are the things that are moving someone from their country or their place of origin to another place? So rather than looking at the United States as this beacon or of hope and opportunity for lots of different folks, we look at it from the perspective of all global dynamics, of resources, a movement of resources, a movement of people, and the politics that sort of generate those movements as well. In doing this, we essentially will decentralize the sort of default body or the default perspective of white European. I wouldn't call it necessarily superiority, although superiority is definitely something that has been woven into the way that race has been socially constructed in the United States, and we'll get to that in particular when we talk about the eugenics movement and immigration. But we decentralize Europeanness and whiteness if we reorient ourselves to be focused on different types of cultures and their experience of the same periods of American history. The next thing that I want to talk about with you today is Reconstruction. Now, this is one of the most fascinating periods of American history that largely gets overlooked or brushed over because of more exciting things that precede it and other exciting things that come after it. Reconstruction is the period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of real industrialization that happens in the United States. During Reconstruction, the United States, particularly the break between the North and the South, makes an effort to try to weave the country back together again, and in doing so, the government focused largely on rebuilding the economic strength of the United States as the United States then turned from an internal conflict to engage globally with the rest of the world. As a result, certain concessions are made when it comes to the rights of Africans and African Americans in the United States as a result of the end of slavery. These concessions come in many forms, particularly in the sort of social and legal dynamics in the South. Some of the key features of Reconstruction essentially are listed here, but the big takeaway from each of these features is that even though slavery is legally banned in the United States as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, these laws are created essentially to still position blacks in the United States as lesser than in value and political power their white counterparts, both male and female. So one might ask, what was the particular advantage for not giving African Americans full political, social, and economic rights? Well, when we talk about race being socially constructed, in part, this has to do with the sort of the pseudoscientific explanation of the differences in the races that I think will be discussed in week 3, but also I'll discuss it a little bit and when we start talking about eugenics. But there's also particular economic power to be had in terms of economic movement or social movement in the United States. So in order to maintain white superiority and the economic structure as it stood before the Civil War, which minus the inclusion of free black labor, thrived for most white people. And I say most white people because that's important. We'll talk about that when we talk about immigration reform. It's much more advantageous to the capitalist structure to maintain some kind of control of economic mobility for specific groups of people so that you continue to have that distribution of wealth that capitalism so strongly depends upon. So the eugenics movement also occurs, kind of overlaps with the end of Reconstruction, which was about from 1865 to 1877, and the eugenics movement begins right at the 1870s. Eugenics is an interesting phenomenon in that it occurred for over 100 years in the United States, and it was effort to sort of pull out those particular genes in the American genetic pool that were deemed unworthy and unfit. Oftentimes, these had to do with individuals who were had mental health challenges, who demonstrated subpar intellect as determined by certain measures of the time, but it also had to do with those who were racially undesirable as well. It's a little known fact that forced sterilization laws were passed in 2/3 of the United States between the 1870s and the 1970s in an effort to, again, weed out that genetic makeup in the American genetic pool. This is a shameful part of American history, among other shameful parts of American history. It is also thought that the eugenics movements in the United States inspired much of the similar efforts in Nazi Germany during World War II as well. So as you can see, this coupling of both pseudoscience and economics and class reinforces the idea of inferiority and superiority in the United States and embeds it in legal structures to maintain that stratification based on largely race, but in other cases also different forms of status. Our next topic is about immigration reform, and here I'm covering a huge again, another 100 years worth of American history. And again, you'll have time during the lesson part and the different resources that I'll supply to dig a little deeply into each one of these elements. Immigration history in the United States is actually intricately linked to both the economy of the U.S. and to the way that race is socially constructed. There are a number of different sort of laws that were passed in the United States to restrict the number of immigrants and immigrants from specific areas of the world from coming to the U.S. as it occurred to the economic advantages of the capitalist enterprise. For example, in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese immigrants came to the United States primarily on the West Coast to help with the construction of railroads. And since they were coming in large numbers for economic opportunities, there was a real fear that the dominant white majority would be overcome by the number of Chinese immigrants that were coming to the U.S. So in an effort to maintain the whiteness of what it meant to be American, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. Likewise, as industrialization started to take hold in the United States, both because of the expansion of the railroad and expansion of other global transportation systems, the United States passed the Immigration Quotas Act of 1924 to limit the number of immigrants that come to the United States by country, essentially. And if you look at those records, much of Western Europe, primarily those who were coming from Great Britain and were considered to have a higher quota compared to other parts of the world. But it's also really interesting to note that this is also the area of the world where you'll find a lot of Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants who initially were not considered white like their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. It wasn't until much later in the 20th century when you had second and third generation Italian Americans and Irish Americans where that whiteness was gained as a result of gradual increase of status and gradual Americanization. Between 1942 and 1964, as agriculture was growing in the United States, more agricultural workers were needed. As a result, despite the Quotas Act, the United States implemented the Bracero program to be able to allow more immigrants from the sort of Mexican-American border to come and cross the border to be able to work the agricultural industry. In 1964, however, as you can, if that that date rather sounds familiar to you, this is also about the time of the major Civil Rights Voting Act. This is the height of the civil rights movement, where you had people interested in more equitable access to the kind of freedoms in the United States. And that definitely informed the loosening of the previous 1924 legislation, the Quotas Act, to allow more immigrants to be able to come to the United States. However, you still had, as that number increased, an effort to control that number by the 1986 reform that would occur thereafter. And as I mentioned, the immigration reform and the civil rights movement have significant overlap. While the immigration reform focused mainly on sort of ethnic origins, the civil rights movement is understood to be largely based on racial equality in the form of civil rights such as voting and equal housing. So here I have a few dates that are outlined from the civil rights movement. It's a little known fact that there was indeed a Civil Rights Act of 1865 that was shortly after the end of the Civil War. That act, I think, prematurely tried to enact many of the gains that were made during the Civil Rights Movement and was actually repealed, and many parts of it were repealed in legislation as a result of Reconstruction. But it wasn't until 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education that we saw real momentum legally in terms of the civil rights movement. And of course, there were a number of social activities, including boycotts, that were happening with many of our major civil rights leaders, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, President Johnson enacts the Voting Rights Act that secures voting rights for all Americans, including African Americans who had been previously unfairly barred from voting registration and voter participation. Likewise, 3 years later, you have the Fair Housing Act, which was allowed for equal housing regardless of racial, ethnic, or gendered status. A couple of things that are little known about the civil rights movement. At the same time, we largely associate it with the rights for African Americans. Many other ethnic and racial groups were very active during the civil rights movement as well, including the American Indians, what is known as the Chicano movement, which is largely of Mexican Americans, as well as the Asian American movement as well, in addition to feminism and gay and lesbian rights as well. So that brings us up to where we are today. And for me, this is a really interesting period, largely because when I first started my career over a decade ago, it was very challenging to convince folks that we did not live in a post-racial America, that the idea of racism was still alive and well in the United States and had just changed forms since the Civil Rights Movement. Some of those key features include the idea of gentrification. Gentrification, if you're not familiar with it, is when you have a low-income area, which has been historically usually populated by Black and brown folk, that is taken over by developers to build more upscale dwellings and businesses that bring in lots of usually white people. So and the gentrifying effect, meaning the elevating of the socioeconomic status effect, also has racial connections as well. Many of us at this point, in 2021, after the summer of 2020, are very familiar with the notion of racial profiling. But there's also ideas of inequality and racism embedded in the notion of feminism. Sort of activist, poet, and writer Audre Lorde wrote a wonderful piece discussing the notion of feminism and the inequitable treatment of the issues facing Black women compared to white women. And so the idea of race as it relates to the way that we engage with feminism definitely touches upon, again, those issues of intersectionality that we talked about earlier in this presentation. So that was a quick and fast overview of lots of different things related to the notion of race, starting all the way from colonization all the way up to where we are now in what is 2022. What I'm hoping that you took away from this presentation is the idea that race is socially constructed. And in that, when we look at the way that has been sort of put together in past generations, to me, I find hope in that if it's man-made or human-made or person-made, that it can be unmade through our actions in the present day and future generations. Idealistic, I know, but the science and the evidence tells us that people made this, people can unmake it. And then also, that race is intricately linked to notions of gender, definite class and economics, ethnicity, and religion. And so to talk about race, we must talk about these other contours as well. I have a number of resources that are listed in this presentation, but they'll also be listed throughout the module that you can dig a little bit more deeply into. I tried to list them according to the order that they are listed in this presentation, so you can kind of follow along and pause and read deeply and go back as you see fit. But otherwise, there'll be an opportunity for us to engage in conversation with one another later this week in the live Q&A, and I look forward to answering your questions and having a conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you learned a lot, thought a lot, felt a lot, and have plans to think about the ways in which you might be part of the remaking of the way that we think about race moving forward.